Thank you all for being here, and thank you to Professor Stiglitz and Professor Pradier for giving me the opportunity to present my work. I'm Thomas Douenne, I'm a PhD candidate at Paris School of Economics, and the paper I'm going to present today is joint work with Adrien Fabre, who is another PhD student at PSE. He is currently visiting NYU, so he cannot be here today. But so we wrote together this paper that is entitled Yellow Vests, Endogenous Beliefs and Carbon Tax Aversion. This is a slightly different title than the one you probably saw, but this is the same paper. As you all know, about a year ago, the Yellow Vest movement started, and it initially gathered protests against high fuel prices and against the taxes that were accused to generate these high prices. This soon led the French government to cancel the increase of the carbon tax that were initially scheduled, leaving a lot of uncertainty about the future of climate policies. One of the key drivers of this protest was undoubtedly the burden that the taxes are imposing on households' purchasing power. Economists are well aware of these distributive effects of energy taxes, and one of the proposals that has emerged is something known as tax and dividend, which is the idea of taxing carbon and using the revenue of the carbon tax to redistribute lump sum to all households. And this strategy has been recently supported by over 3,000 economists in the Wall Street Journal with a two-sided objective, and I quote, it's to maximize the fairness and political viability of a rising carbon tax. Interestingly, the implicit assumption behind this is that if one is able to design a policy whose properties are aligned with people's preferences, then public support should follow. The question we want to ask in this paper is that really sufficient? And what we will argue is that if one wants to understand people's attitudes toward policies, it needs not only to take into account their preferences, but also their beliefs. This leads us to the following research question, which is, how does the interaction between people's beliefs and preferences affect their attitude toward policies? And we want to study this in the context of carbon taxation in France during the Yellow Vest movement. And as I will show, regarding carbon taxation, belief plays a critical role, which makes this example, I think, an important case study. So the contribution of the paper are mainly twofold. The first one is with respect to the political economy of climate policies. The literature has stressed three main motives for the acceptance of such a policies. So whether one thinks he wins or lose from the policy, so what we can call self-interest. Then how does he perceive the effectiveness of the policy in terms of environmental effectiveness, and distributive concern, which is usually proxied by progressivity. So what we show in this paper is that beliefs with respect to these three aspects are consistently biased, and we quantify this bias, we show their degree of persistence when we provide new information, and then, thanks to our survey design, we estimate what is the causal impact of holding certain beliefs on acceptance of the policy. And then, beyond the case of carbon taxation, the paper contributes to the literature on endogenous beliefs, and in particular, motivated beliefs, and how they relate to attitude of our policies, which enables us to discuss the concept of tax aversion in the context of the carbon tax, but as we previously saw, this could well apply beyond this case for inheritance tax, for example. So to answer these questions, we designed a survey that we administered online over a sample of 3,000 people that are representative of the French population. I won't describe here the full survey, I just want to focus on the main policies that we study. So this policy is a tax and dividend, which has been supported by a majority of a large number of economists. And so we make this proposal, we specify to people what will be the associated increase in energy prices, the amount of transfers households will receive, and then we ask questions about their perception of the policy and their attitude towards it. The first thing we find is that despite economists' consensus over the fact that this will help for the political viability of a rising carbon tax, people will actually largely reject such a proposal. But what we also find is that the rejection is associated with biased beliefs over the property of the policy. And in particular, they overestimate the cost of the policy on their own purchasing power. They wrongly think it's regressive, while it's actually a progressive policy, and they do not perceive it as environmentally effective. So just to give you an illustration on what we do to estimate their bias with respect to their own gains, in blue you have the distribution of people's net gains from the policy that is computed using official statistics, so consumer survey data. And in red, you have the subjective beliefs about people's gain elicited from our survey. You see that it's really shifted to the left, which shows that people consistently underestimate their net gains from the policy. And just to give you a number, we estimate that 70% of households should win from this policy, but only 14% think they would. So then we can use information about our respondents to compute a respondent-specific estimation of the tax incidence. And thanks to this, we can, at the respondent level, look at the degree of bias with respect to their own gains. And then, if we regress this on many covariates, we can see what are the determinants of biased belief. And what we find is that the people that are the most opposed to the policy, and in particular the yellow vests, are also the ones that have the most important bias regarding their own gains. The question then is in which direction does the causality go? So is that because people are too pessimistic that they reject carbon tax policies? Or did they endogenously form this bias in order to sustain an initial negative attitude toward the policy? So we want to disentangle these two effects, and to do this, we use our respondent-specific information, estimation of the tax incidence, to tell respondents whether they are estimated to gain or to lose from the policy. We tell them that this information is correct in 5 cases over 6, which is a probability that we estimated ourselves out of sample. And then we look at how do they revise their beliefs given this information. Just to give you 2 numbers, here you can see that revision is quite asymmetric. So if people initially think they will win, and we tell them that they are expected to lose with a probability of 5 out of 6, they tend to revise their beliefs in a Bayesian way, so a bit more than 80% of them agree with our feedback. But on the other hand, if people initially thought that they were going to lose, and we tell them that they are expected to win, only 12% of them agree with our feedback. So this is a very pessimistic treatment of new information, which shows that they do not only have biased beliefs, but they form their beliefs endogenously. And if we look at the heterogeneity in this beliefs formation and in the beliefs revision, what we see is that people that are the most against the tax are also the ones that are the less likely to correctly revise their beliefs. And this is even more true for more educated people, which shows that this endogenous formation of belief doesn't come from a cognitive deficiency, but rather from an adaptative mechanism, which is evidence of motivated reasoning. So beliefs are formed endogenously because of people's initial attitude. What we now want to find is whether their beliefs later affect their attitude towards the policy. So because the information we provide, so we provide also random information on the tax effectiveness and the tax progressivity. So these information are random or conditionally random in the case of the feedback that we give them. Then we can use it as instrument to obtain exogenous variation in beliefs about one's own gain or tax effectiveness, and look at what is the causal effect of holding these beliefs on the acceptance of the policy. And what we find is that holding beliefs about one's own gain affects the approval by a large amount. So looking at the local average treatment effect, we have a very high effect of 55 percentage points. Looking at the whole population is somehow a lower effect, but still all beliefs largely affect approval of the policy. And we also find that in a very hypothetical scenario where we could convince everyone that they win if they do, that the policy is effective and progressive, the tax could be approved by a large majority, as high as 90%. Which clearly shows that the rejection of the tax doesn't come from people's intrinsic preferences, but from biased beliefs. So implying that the rejection could come at quite a high welfare cost. So to conclude, we have shown that even if we are able to design a progressive policy, carbon taxation will be largely rejected by French households, but this is because they hold biased beliefs about the properties of the tax. These beliefs are formed endogenously through motivated reasoning, which can create a vicious circle of tax aversion. So people are initially against the tax, and they process information endogenously against this tax, which, beyond the case of carbon taxation, may be a strong mechanism which, from a policy that has initially a low public support, could then, even if it's welfare improving, have a hard time convincing people. And more optimistically, we do find that if we can somehow convince people about the true properties of the mechanism, we will have a majority approval. So the remaining challenges are quite clear, I think. So the first one, in the very short run, is to find the right package of climate policies to go forward with fighting climate change. In the longer run, the question is really how to restore public trust, and I think that's a great challenge, even beyond the case of climate policies. Thank you, and I'll be glad to take your questions.
Well, I really enjoyed reading your paper and your very brief presentation. It's much richer than you had time to describe. Maybe I should begin by pointing out all of the former chairman of the Federal Reserve and all the former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors signed that letter, except for me. And so let me explain why I was one of the people who did not support the idea, support the letter. And it gives you a little bit of the texture of why I think there is some difficulties. The letter and the proposal was that all of the dividends be used for, all the revenues be used for a uniform dividend. And one of the things that I've argued is that addressing climate change is going to need very high levels of public investment. And to that means we're going to have to use find tax revenues and to give money away and then particularly say to rich people and then to tax it back again seems foolish, inefficient, and so just focusing on the dividend, the redistribution doesn't, is a policy that is less effective, I think, than an investment policy. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, well, you want me to say everything I said again? No. The second thing is the letter that he referred to made a lot of it was drafted by some conservatives, Republicans, and made a lot of derogatory remarks about regulation and said, regulation onerous, distortionary, and less effective than prices. And that was I think it's very interesting because that is an example of a perception that is probably at odds with, more consistent if you would ask the question, which is more effective, prices or regulation. I think you would have gotten a vast majority saying that regulation is more effective. So the odd person out in this discussion are the economists, not the people that you were interviewing, who think of, in their back of their minds, they're thinking of, there are better ways of stopping electric generating people from polluting, just not allow coal-fired generating. Why do we have to give them a price incentive that costs us so much? Just stop it. And there's lots of other things along those lines. In a way, as economists, we've been indoctrinated, or you've been indoctrinated, into ideas about what are the most effective tools, i.e. the price system is the most effective tool. And that's why I wrote an article which you noted was that just came out on the use of price and non-price tools as including regulations and investments as the best way of addressing the problem of climate change. To me, understanding how economists see the world and understanding how most other individuals see the world, I think is important to see the lens through which we see the world and the lens through which a lot of other people, and there's a gap between those two lenses. I think that part of the answer to the question that you posed at the end is how do we go forward with policies to address climate change, is to go forward with policies that involve more public investment and more regulation. But there's a third thing, which is redistribution. And there are two elements of redistribution that I want to mention. I think for a lot of people, the idea that everybody gets the same amount of money is not progressive. To an economist, in a world where there's a lot of inequality, giving everybody a lump sum is progressive. But our natural intuition is it's somehow not right that Bill Gates, and I'm not picking on Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos, or your guys, should get from the public a grant of $300 so the carbon tax doesn't make it more expensive for them to drive a car. That idea sounds outrageous. And so the first thing is, I think the dividend needs to be more progressive to make people believe that it's progressive. And even though to us, as we measure inequality, a lump sum is progressive, it's not in the mindset of a lot of people, and I think we can design it more. The harder problem that, in effect, that you get at in your paper, but which many economists don't fully take on board, is there are large horizontal inequities in any program. That is to say, at any income level, there are some people who live in rural areas who where there is very little public transportation and where an increase in the gasoline tax will be a very big hardship. And there are other people who live in Paris who can use public transportation where their carbon footprint is obviously lower. And a lot of the problems of opposition are associated with those horizontal inequities. On average, one way of thinking about it, if everybody had the same income, people would still be worried about the adverse effect. Because we know if everybody had the same income, the lump sum grant would be exactly the same as the tax, right? And if they care about the environment at all, which they should, they would say, I have to be better off. but why can they? Why do they? Why could they be worse off? Because they think that in one way or another, they are among the people who have a bigger carbon footprint than others, than average, than others of their income. And it can't be the case. I mean, in the United States, we always joke about, all my students all of them are in the top half of the class. You should know, you can't all be in the top half of your class, right? Well, in this area, all the people believe that they are in the bottom half in terms of their costs are going to be that they're facing are going to be greater than the dividend that they're going to get back. Can't be the case for everybody. On average, they're getting back the same amount. And so if you asked them, to apply some logic, how could that be? Well, and especially you would think in France with your rigorous math training, they would have been able to figure this out, that they can't all be losers, just as a logic, right? And you have such good math training here. So what else could be going on? Well, I think what else could be going on, in part, may be that there's a lot of uncertainty that they have about their carbon footprint. They don't know whether they are below or above average. And so they don't know whether they are going to be hurt or helped. But if they're risk averse, they're going to oppose it just out of risk aversion. And I'm not sure, and this is how this gets incorporated in your Bayesian updating, or how it should get but I know just in a simple model that you could write down that if there's that kind of uncertainty about whether I am above average or below average in carbon footprint, I don't know whether I'm a winner or a loser, and if I'm risk averse, I should be worried and would probably oppose it if there's enough variance. Making it even more difficult, not even economists can agree either on the general equilibrium effects or on the distribution effects. So what do I mean by that? Well, Trump makes a big deal about the Paris Agreement being unfair to American workers. Don't take anything he says seriously, but what does he mean? He thinks that somehow a carbon price or an implicit carbon price is going to lower wages because it will lower the demand for coal miners. Now, we've tried to explain to him that there are 3 to 5 times many solar panel installers than there are coal miners, and that probably the Paris Agreement would drive up the wages of unskilled workers rather than drive them down. But in general, the general equilibrium and incidence of these taxes are really hard. And while you cite some studies that talk about a carbon tax being regressive by itself without the lump sum, there are other studies that say actually the carbon footprint, a carbon tax is progressive by itself. That rich people drive more and have, on average, bigger cars, even though poor people have less efficient cars. But there are a whole, so when I've looked through the literature, and I guess I'd say there is a lot of uncertainty among economists. Well, if there's uncertainty among economists, how is the layperson supposed to know whether they're going to be hurt or helped. But if they don't know, they're going to say, well, there's going to be a probability distribution, but there's uncertainty. And if I'm risk averse, maybe this is not the best way of dealing with the problem. So I think there are some other elements that help explain some of the biases, the reactions, and one of the reasons I think that one needs the kind of portfolio approach where you use regulation. Finally, let me make two comments about, or a couple comments about endogenous preferences, which I think are really interesting questions. One of the studies that he cites has this, I often use in my class, because I ask our students, what do you think is the correlation between belief in climate change and the level of education? How many think that more educated people believe that climate change is a problem? You all, I can see you. Yeah. Well, it's not true in the United States. In the United States, the correlation between education and belief in climate change is negative. And why? It has to do with endogenous preferences and, in particular, with the cultural determinant of preferences. Because if you divide Americans into two groups, Republicans and Democrats, and these are different cultures, we don't talk to each other, we live in different worlds. The Republicans, on average, are more educated, used to be. I mean, forget about the Trump people, but all those CEOs, so on average they used to be more educated, and the Republicans as a culture do not believe in climate change. So within each of the two groups, there is a systematic correlation. Positive, the normal one. More educated Democrats believe in climate change, more educated Republicans believe in climate change. But the Republicans don't believe in science. Knowledge, they think universities are bad things. And Trump's tax code in December 2017, for the first time ever in any country, imposed a tax on our best universities, Harvard and Princeton, and they're anti-knowledge. So their curve is they don't believe in climate change. So you confound those two together and you get this negative slope. So that's where the cultural determination of beliefs becomes very important. And that leads, you used the word motivated beliefs. I think of it more as confirmatory, older language, or confirmatory bias. People have lenses through which they see the world that are shaped by their priors and by their culture. And the priors of the Republicans are that climate science is fake science. And no matter what you tell them, they will deny it. And they grab on that one study that said somewhere in the world some glacier is not shrinking. And they say, well, and give you, last, I don't know if you, last winter, we had some record cold temperatures in the Midwest. I mean, really, people were dying. It was really terrible. And Trump tweeted, so much for your global warming theory. Without realizing, he's so stupid. you know, climate change is also about increased variance in temperature. And it's been part of climate science for a very long time, that it increases the variability. And the evidence on that is very strong. When I was on the IPCC in one of the lead authors in 1995, we didn't include it in our report because at that point we didn't think the evidence was strong enough. We believed it. But then subsequently it got added as the evidence became overwhelming, and the theory behind that was, again, pretty compelling even at that time. So anyway, the point I want to make is that there's a large literature in psychology about confirmatory bias and the lens through which you see the world. I think what has been added by the recent literature in behavioral economics, what I call strand 2, the cultural determinants, is that your lens are shaped by the people around you, the people that you associate with. And that means that if you're in that culture, that really makes it more and more difficult to change your view. And in his paper, he pointed out that he has a very good discussion of why are the yellow vests more resilient to information. And I'm right?
Yeah.
And you suggested that part of the reason is that they created, these were people who were isolated, and when they came together, they helped create a culture that gave them a set of shared identity and a shared view that made it more and more difficult to resist. Now, maybe one final comment, which is that the lens through which you see any particular event is also affected by, you might say, surrounding events that happen over a period of time. And you mentioned trust in government, and there were two things that have happened, one more recently, but one over a long period of time. And I did a little traveling in France while I've been here, and gone to some of the Le Pen country to find out, what, these are really n equals 1 or 2. So I don't want to claim any, but it's consistent with what other people who've done more systematic surveys have found. And so I went into, a rural area, a farm, and we're Le Pen supporters. And one of the things that's happened over the last 5, 10, 15 years is public transportation has been taken away. Life has become, in many, many ways, much more difficult. Decisions about closing post offices, decisions of a whole set of things that have made people more isolated, and where they see the quality of their life being determined from people in Paris, and so it has generated a lack of trust, in which they see, these are cases where they've experienced negative, you might call it negative shocks from policies from the center. So that affects their priors. When you say, okay, I'm doing something for you, they say, now come on. You said, don't worry about taking away the public transportation, don't worry about this, and the quality of our life has gone down. And then when you add to that, lowering taxes on the richest French in the beginning of Macron's administration, it doesn't say that really our heart is with you in redistribution. And it makes it more difficult to say, trust us, this is a policy that is redistributive and will make you better off. So I think you have to, look at some of these reactions as embedded in experiences that people have had over the last couple years and over the last 10 or 15 years.
Thank you.